Joining us on the State of the Nation today, we have the renowned economist and one of the sane voices in South Africa, Dr. Azar Jammine. Dr. Jammine. Azar, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're in deep trouble when you've got two Lebanese people speaking to you, but here we are anyway. Azar, welcome, as we said. The big current thing that's occupying South Africa is we've run out of money.
Without a doubt, we've run out of money, and it's no big surprise. It's been a long time coming, and it's now hitting home. Why it's sounding even worse than it really need be is because the ANC has developed policies which suggest that it will need a hell of a lot more money than another organization may have needed. When you start talking about a national health insurance scheme, a basic income grant, land expropriation, and SOEs that need to be fixed instead of privatized, you're really talking about massive bucks. And there's no way that the government can collect taxes sufficiently to come anywhere close to funding those ideas.
Now, let's take a step back as to how we got here, because we got here, as I see it, through a couple of things which we are now treating the symptoms and not the cause, or it's the other way around. I always get that one confused. But the real issue is that South Africa has increasingly adopted more and more business unfriendly policies. So therefore, our economy, it shows in the unemployment numbers and our growth numbers, or lack thereof.
Mike, yes, that's one way of looking at it, but you've been very specific. The fact is that there have been many structural weaknesses in the economy that have contributed towards it growing far, far too slowly to generate the kind of tax revenues that are needed to start embarking upon the largesse that the government is looking at. And somehow they don't put two and two together. They can't see that it's the very weaknesses that are partly a function of the way they've been managing the economy that have contributed towards low economic growth, and that is the problem why they are running out of money. Things like corruption and state capture, the relative weakness of the educational system, and how that, together with cadre deployment, has resulted in huge amounts of incompetence in a lot of our public authorities to actually do the job that they're supposed to do. And nowhere is it clearer than in the state-owned enterprises. And the government quite rightly has been saying and announced on a number of occasions big infrastructural investment programs. We haven't seen them being implemented because it cannot see that saying that on the one hand and being corrupt and pursuing cadre deployment just don't go hand in hand. And then the other feature, of course, is the deterioration in the implementation of enforcement of law and order, which has interrupted the implementation of any of these projects still further. When you've got people sabotaging them left, right, and center, you're not going to make any progress.
And of course, it's come to all of that perfect storm has happened in some very critical areas of the country, right?
Of course, the most important one obviously being energy, the second most important being transport and logistics. Yeah, those are the two big ones.
Yeah, which interestingly, the one is being run by the former Secretary General of the ANC, Gwede Mantashe, who talks interestingly talks about coal and the how important it is to keep our coal industry afloat, but yet doesn't add any megawatts to our grid. And then, of course, the other problem, Transnet was under the control of the current Secretary General, who watched, as we all did, the videos of our transport infrastructure being eroded and stolen every day.
Isn't it sad to see how all that has happened? And so much of it is due to dogmatic approaches to these issues, instead of being open to, I'm thinking Gwede Mantashe. Why, for so many years, did he not allow businesses to start generating electricity for themselves?
Yeah. Now, just recently we had Stavros Nicolaou here from Aspen Pharmacare. They in tight with the government. They obviously made a fortune out of the COVID vaccine rollout. He's now in business unity, business leadership, every organization that's there.
BRICS as well. No?
BRICS as well. And that sector of formal business, represented by the biggest corporates in the country, the banks, the big mining houses, the cell phone operators, the drug companies, getting into bed with the ANC, even though he vehemently denies it.
Undoubtedly, there's a lot of, obviously, collusion between big business and the ANC. And the tragedy of this economy, and I realized it so starkly, last month I went on a trip to Peru, tourism, and what astonished me was it's a country like South Africa, well endowed with tremendous mineral riches and agricultural strength, and no one was begging. And I looked around, I didn't see any shopping centers, I didn't see any signs of big business. Everyone had a job, was going around doing his own bit.
Yeah.
And I realized why we've got such a high unemployment rate, because we've got too much of the economy concentrated in the hands of big business, organized labor, and government that controls the so-called golden triangle, which is stifling this economy.
Yeah.
We should be seeing small business proliferating all over the place, especially where you've got a relative lack of skills in so many areas. You don't have to be highly skilled to run a small business all the time, but it's being made very difficult to do so with all the regulations that are being put in place.
Yeah. Well, I've said this many times. The thing that terrifies the ANC the most is agency. That is, people in South Africa being able to fend for themselves, which makes them less dependent on government, right? So they will do everything in their power to disempower their own electorate, because it makes them far more dependent on the government.
Unfortunately, I think you're dead right, because I've often asked myself, why have we made so little progress on the education front since, yes, we had apartheid education, and one can blame a lot of things on that. But since 1994 is now nearly 30 years, and the education system, if anything, has been crippled still further. Why? And people often said, oh, but the ANC don't want the people to be educated, because then the moment they're educated, they stand up and they see the flaws in the ANC, and they start opposing the ANC. And maybe that's what we are seeing with the rise in a whole lot of these other political parties now. But there's a lot of truth in this, and the whole legacy of Jacob Zuma with a standard 4. If I can become president with a standard 4, then I don't need no education. And of course, we are running out of skills like anything at the moment, because immigration is now taking off to such an extent.
Okay, so let's we've now discussed how we got here,
yeah,
and how we continue to stay here. But right now, I mean, as we know, at this very period in time, the government is scrambling. They literally cannot pay their debts, and they're running out of the company credit card is being maxed out. What are the options now? We did hear our finance minister. I'm always terrified when these politicians start wearing hats, right? Because that usually is a good place to hide, and to hide your weaknesses. But anyway, we have another behatted cabinet minister who's not doing his job, and that's the finance minister. He is, however, saying, guys, we either have to cut back on what we're spending or we have to increase what we're receiving. It's almost impossible with the electricity situation to receive more. We've missed the last commodity boom. And the only option seems to be to cut back, but that ahead of an election seems highly unlikely. What are the ANC's options here?
They don't have many options. Without economic growth picking up, they have very few options. If they want to maintain an element of stability in the country, they have to cut back. And I see he made an announcement a couple of days ago about a number of programs, some of which were actually quite commendable, that he's got to cut out now because of this. And on the other side, there are smatterings of discussion that we need to raise the rate of VAT by 2% in order, for example, to extend the special social grant of 350 Rand a month to beyond March 2024. Obviously, coming up to the election, the ANC wants to sell this. Well, how are you going to raise 45 billion Rand extra? The easiest way in the short term is to raise the rate of VAT. But that, of course, is going to start causing all sorts of ructions within the tripartite alliance itself. So the ANC is really caught in a cleft stick at the moment. I don't see how it can get out of this, implement what it says it's going to, and at the same time avoid a total collapse of the fiscal situation in the country.
But I think we've got to be careful, Azar, don't we, to make it sound like this is the ANC's problem. Because ultimately they may cause the problem, but ultimately the burden lies with the South African taxpayer.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Well, there are not many.
Yeah, well, there's not many taxpayers, but there are many South Africans. We're going to be burdened whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
What are some of the implications?
Well, of course, I was wrong by saying there are not many taxpayers because, of course, on VAT, everyone is a taxpayer. And that is the very big danger that the ANC will face if it raises the rate of VAT. If it raises the rate of VAT, the inflation rate will pick up and economic growth will deteriorate still further. But in the short term, it will enable the ANC to fulfill its promise of extending the special social grant to people. Essentially, the ANC has to find a way of stopping corruption within its ranks. And it's absolutely rife. It is rotten to the core.
But now we spent a lot of time now in this session talking about the ANC as if it's their problem. They do have a problem. They've got an election coming up. But I think what we've got to do, and we would do well to do it, is to explain to people that are watching this that this may be a political problem for the ANC one way or another. And, the less we can talk about them, the better. But ultimately, this is going to be a problem borne by the Republic of South Africa and all of its citizens.
Correct.
So let's just go down that road. Let's take the politics out of it. We've got to the point where we've used up all of our money. Nobody wants to really buy our bonds because why would you? The currency looks set to absolutely tank. When we do get into go over the fiscal cliff. Let's explain to people what is actually awaiting us thanks to this kind of situation.
Well, if you take that string of action and you deny the possibility that Godongwana might just try to hold the fort, and that the ANC does actually start doing away with a lot of expenditure and doesn't fulfill all its promises in order to stick to its budgets and prevent the public debt from rising too much. If you say that that's impossible, then what we are likely to land up in is what many countries have experienced, which is a massive upturn in their debt, having to borrow a hell of a lot more, having to pay higher and higher interest rates on those borrowings, to the extent that what they have to spend on paying interest squeezes out the ability to spend on anything else, especially vital areas of expenditure, education, housing, social welfare, healthcare, and that sort of thing. And instead, what you see is investors shying away from buying South African bonds more and more, so that interest rates rise still further. It becomes a vicious circle, and your money doesn't come into the country to the same extent. You have a deterioration in your terms of trade and your current account, and the currency takes the knock. And as you suggested, then the rand would go for a total ball of chalk. You would end up with massive inflation. The people who would really suffer, or the people who would suffer more, are your absolutely poor, those who cannot afford to pay more and more for food and fuel. The wealthier, well, they've already invested, and invested with a large chunk of their money invested in foreign assets, whether they've put the money overseas or whether they've invested through South African institutions who have 40% of those assets overseas already. Those people will be relatively protected in such an environment. In fact, some of them might benefit because the rand value of their assets that are overseas start increasing.
Yeah. Now, when I put something similar to Stavros Nicolau, he said, no, don't worry, small business will always be okay, and everybody will start selling solar, right? Systems like that's going to be the only industry. Don't know who's going to buy all of these solar.
No, I'm told that now solar is going to be taxed.
Yes. But I do want to suggest that I've got a good business opportunity, and we may make a lot of money out of buying chalkboards, because you're going to get far better use out of chalkboards in restaurants and retail stores than out of menus and pricing on products, because the products might have to change from the morning to the afternoon, the prices of the products, right? That is what has happened in Zimbabwe. That is what has happened in Argentina.
I wasn't aware, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Is that you no longer print menus because you can't keep up with the pricing. You put the pricing on chalkboards so that you can rub it out and increase the price. And you end up in a situation, just to cheer everybody up, you end up in a situation where when you go to a restaurant, you pay before you order, right? Yeah. Because by the time you finish the meal, the price may have increased. But it's a desperate situation.
Yeah, there's one institution that's standing in the way of that happening right now.
And that is?
The South African Reserve Bank.
Yeah, and obviously we do know that the South African Reserve Bank has been under siege.
Yes.
To change exactly this. Now, let's just talk about what we could expect to see as a response. We've already seen the political response, which is the ANC cozying up to the BRICS countries.
I don't see what benefit there is to that. They haven't seen a big benefit. And the most stark manifestation of this was that I had a hell of a problem getting back to South Africa from Brazil a couple of weeks ago, because they wouldn't, well, fortunately there are now direct flights that have been reintroduced, but for goodness sake, we've been in BRICS together for years and we haven't been able to logistically commute between the two countries properly. Now you tell me that BRICS has been working.
Well, the way I see it, and I actually did a little bit of work around the BRICS event, is that it seems like South Africa's entire sort of hope lies on cheap Chinese money, in the hope that the Chinese then won't hold us to account. So we'll lend billions of, I presume not dollars because they're trying to de-dollarize, that's a whole other discussion, but we'll lend a pile of money from the Chinese in the hope that the Chinese forget about it and don't ask us for that money back, because the Bretton Woods institutions...
Well, you know what the irony of all this is, that most of the money that we are getting from these institutions comes basically from the West.
Yeah.
The Chinese haven't given us a hell of a lot of money. And in other countries where they have lent a lot of money, they've wanted their pound of flesh back.
Yes.
Make no mistake about it. So I think we're very, very misguided if we think that we're going to solve our problem that way.
Yeah, and to those that don't know, there's a wonderful Chinese way of recouping their debts, right? And that is that they've taken strategic assets from countries that have been indebted to them, right? They've taken ports away with an exclusion zone, which they've then populated with just purely Chinese people to run as their own port home away from home. They've taken certain assets. I know in Zambia they took assets. In Tanzania they've taken assets. To those people that think that the Chinese won't want their money back if they do lend us money, they haven't been reading the tea leaves.
And I mean, thus far, you know, from that point of view, yes, we've done a lot of trade with China, but we haven't really managed to get a hell of a lot of money and investment from the Chinese in South Africa specifically thus far.
So let's look at the global picture then.
Global picture is fascinating at the moment. And the tensions are creeping up from all over the place. And I don't think they were manifested more than in the last couple of weeks, where Narendra Modi really was quite upset that he didn't receive the same kind of reception in South Africa as Xi Jinping did. And then you have the G20 summit in India, in New Delhi, and Xi Jinping doesn't attend, nor does Putin. And Biden rocks up there and then goes straight to Vietnam and cozies up to the Vietnamese. And quite clearly, Biden and the West are cozying up to all the Southeast Asian countries and Japan and Australia, and creating a Pacific alliance that directly opposes China and by inference Russia as well. And then on the other side with BRICS, you had what I found fascinating is so many countries wanted to become part of BRICS, but who were chosen? Fascinating. Argentina, close to being bankrupt because the IMF won't lend them money unless they do certain things. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, all in the Middle East. And then from Africa, not Nigeria or Kenya or something, but Ethiopia. Fascinating. So it shows you there's a hell of a lot of polarization taking place at the moment, and attempts by the big countries, United States, China, India, Russia, to increase their sphere of influence. And they are really battling it out on that front. And that's clearly not conducive towards higher economic growth worldwide going forward.
Let's look at let's talk about China for a minute, because obviously China now is the second biggest economy in the world, world's workshop, but yet they've got enormous problems within their fiscal system.
Very much so, and in their property market as well. And there are many who believe that, you know, the conventional wisdom in the past, as was the case in the 80s. In the 80s, we were told, look at Japan. Great. By the year 2000, Japan's economy will be bigger than that of the US. And so too has there been the common narrative that by the turn of the decade, China's economy will overtake that of the US. And what you're seeing is Chinese economic growth slowing down progressively.
Yeah,
and many people think they're ex-growth now.
There's one substantial difference between Japan of the late 80s and China now. And that is when Japan went into economic, not quite free fall, but ex-growth.
Yeah.
Things stopped happening in Japan. One could argue, at least at that point, Japan were already quite a wealthy country, right?
Yeah.
China's busy going into economic free fall when most of their country remains poor. This is going to be a fundamental problem.
Absolutely.
For China.
It is a fundamental going to be, and they are facing yet another problem, and now that's a demographic one, where their population is no longer growing. They're trying to backtrack on their policy. I mean, that's social engineering of the best kind in limiting people to having one child a family, and it's hitting home massively now on them.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that I follow quite closely. There is an interesting factor with demographic decline, birth rate decline, And that is that all countries are in decline. There's only 3 countries in the world, interestingly, that are growing demographically. But once it sets in, it has yet to be reversed other than by immigration, which is not helpful.
Well, that is one of the huge challenges. I don't think people are looking at this whole immigration and refugee story as if it's an isolated phenomenon, without recognizing that one of the huge dynamics that the world is going to face, and is facing already in a big way, is the fact that especially Europe is in negative population growth. To keep their economy moving, they need more and more people, and yet which is the continent with the highest population growth rate? Africa. So it's a completely natural demographic phenomenon to expect Africans to want to go into Europe. And Europe is going to have to face a lot of problems in that regard. America is facing it to some extent with Mexico, but I don't see that as quite the same, quite as acute. But we're going to see that is a worldwide bombshell that is developing.
So to wrap it up, things ain't looking great. And in South Africa, and so people don't go and that are watching us today, don't go entirely, jump off a cliff. What could be done in South Africa?
Look, some of the things. The first thing to ask is, why is South Africa not collapsing completely with the headwinds we're facing? Part of it is because we've got a very heterogeneous society. Amazingly, creates tensions, but it also creates checks and balances that are preventing social unrest from exploding completely. Secondly, we've got a very, very powerful and abundant NGO sector that is helping out the poor left, right, and center in a way that very, very few countries have. Thirdly, we have religious freedom, and religion plays a very strong role in South Africa. And irrespective of which religion it is, you've got powerful religious groups that are also keeping the wolf at bay. Fourthly, you've got high levels of inequality, which ironically mean that the country doesn't collapse, because those who are educated and are earning well are in control and not allowing things and are accounting for the majority by far of spending. I mean, 15% of the population spends 85% of what is spent in the shops. So the shops carry on having good business. And then finally, at the moment, we've got the social grant network, where 47% of the population actually receive social grants. Where does the hope lie? I believe that with renewable energy, the switch towards renewable energy does provide huge. I'm not saying do away with the coal industry. I think the coal industry still has a very important role to play. But as we move towards renewable energy, if we can stop corruption, there's huge opportunities for business in that sphere. And in particular, no longer only just in terms of the generation of electricity, but the transmission of electricity back from the eastern and northern Capes to Gauteng and the northern parts of the country. A lot of business opportunities there. Secondly, on the transport side, if we can get our rail network working again, we won't have as many potholes in our roads through road transport as we had before. So there are a lot of opportunities there. Then on the other side, technologically, if you look at the numbers, business in South Africa has already been quite proactive. They are investing more and more in machinery and equipment, rendering themselves less dependent on labor, which goes on strike so often, and also AI, pursuing that avenue as well. And I have learnt, I've got grey hair, like yourself, Mike, over time, nothing ever gets as bad as one thinks it could because of man's ingenuity. And I believe there's still a lot of ingenuity in South Africa that can rescue the day.
Well, you mentioned my grey hair. some of my hair. Some of the hair that I still have is a bit grey. But I think, Azar, you may have missed out possibly the most, one of the biggest factors in our favour in South Africa. And I get asked this question a lot. How scared am I of some sort of military coup or revolution in South Africa? South Africans are a noisy bunch. It doesn't quite get to that point, does it?
No, but my very first point when I said the heterogeneity of society is itself a source of stability in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did answer that.
So, you know, it would be really, really difficult for South Africans just to go lying down ahead of a bad government.
Why did the unrest in KwaZulu-Natal in July 2021 remain in KwaZulu-Natal?
Yeah.
Because it was a very ethnically oriented thing, and the rest of the country didn't want to be part of that.
Yeah, and even that, if one looks at that particular situation, was almost dealt with by the private sector as opposed to the state.
That's what I mean by the checks and balances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would be very hard to see South Africa descending into a Zim type of situation. It doesn't look likely, but our government are doing their absolute best to try and get us there.
Yeah.
Azar Jammine, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a delight to speak to you. I'm a member of the State of the Nation tribe. Subscribe to the channel. If you really like us, join our supporters club. We're now starting to put out special content just for the people that support us. So to everybody that's who's joined us today, thank you so much for doing that. For Azar Jammine coming to the studio, it's been great to speak to you. Thank you all, and we'll see you the next time on the State of the Nation.